They questioned his first-class ticket, motioned for him to step aside and murmured behind his back. Yet, none of them grasped he was a federal investigator, meticulously documenting every moment. Terrence Dillard didn't appear to be someone attempting to prove a point. He wasn't ostentatious, wore no prominent brands and had no need to. A deep gray sports coat over a crisp white shirt, navy trousers, leather shoes polished to a soft sheen. His entire demeanor conveyed a man assured of himself, with nothing to demonstrate to anyone. Boarding time at Dallas Love Field hummed with typical pre-flight chatter. The loudspeaker announced first-class passengers for Flight 265 to Seattle. Terrence stood, adjusted the strap on his leather briefcase, and approached the priority boarding lane. He waited patiently behind a young Caucasian couple in fleece hoodies and sandals. The agent smiled and scanned their passes without a second glance. Then came Terrence's turn. He stepped forward, offered a slight smile and presented his boarding pass. The flight attendant, a blonde woman in her mid-40s with a rigid ponytail and weary eyes, looked at her screen, then up at him, then down again. "Are you certain this is your seat, sir?" she inquired, her voice a little too loud. Terrence offered a polite nod. "Yes, ma'am. Seat 2A, first class." She didn't scan the ticket, she just stood there, blinking as if her display had frozen. "I'll just need to verify something swiftly," she said, then turning away. "Can you just move aside for a moment?" There was the shift, subtle but distinct. Not an outright refusal, not yet, but enough to draw gazes, enough to attract unneeded attention. Terrence moved to the side, outwardly composed. Internally he sensed that familiar flicker. Not anger, not yet, just a profound inner sigh. He'd witnessed this before countless times. But this time it wasn't just happening to him. It was occurring while he was on duty, even if no one around him knew it yet. He observed the line advance. No one else was questioned. A teenager in an oversized hoodie strode past and scanned in without a word. A man in a faded fishing cap winked at the flight attendant as he passed. She chuckled, scanned him through and didn't even glance at his name. Terrence checked his watch. He wasn't rushed. He'd allocated the entire day for this journey, and if anything, delays merely contributed to the report he was mentally compiling. The first-class line emptied. The woman returned, now with another attendant, younger, perhaps mid-30s, a redhead with an expression somewhere between skepticism and bewilderment. They both examined his boarding pass, then each other. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're just attempting to confirm your seat assignment," the second woman stated. Terrence kept his voice low and steady. "What precisely are you verifying?" The older attendant shifted. "We're simply not seeing this seat under your name in the system. It's probably a mix-up, happens sometimes." He gently retrieved the boarding pass from her hand and held it up. "My name is Terrence Dillard, Seat 2A, TSA pre-check, and yes, I booked directly through the airline's website as always." The second attendant's smile was strained. "It's probably just a technical issue, like she said. Just need to confirm it with a supervisor. It'll be quick." He gave a brief nod and stepped further aside. Behind him, a few passengers whispered. Someone 2 rows back chuckled under their breath. One man muttered, "Knew this would happen," just loud enough for Terrence to hear. He said nothing, simply stood watching the gate agent pick up a phone and make a quiet call, watching people glance his way then quickly look away, pretending not to notice. He adjusted the strap on his briefcase again, not from nervousness but habit. People observed a man standing alone at a gate being questioned and they filled in the blanks themselves. They always did. But that hesitation was only the beginning. Terrence had stood there for 6 minutes. That might not sound like much, but in airport time, especially when you're being observed as if you don't belong, it extends long and uncomfortable. Long enough for passengers to finish their drinks, adjust their headphones and murmur quiet remarks without even trying to lower their voices. The gate agent hung up the phone and turned back to him with the same practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Our supervisor is en route, just a moment longer." Terrence gave a simple nod, still composed, still silent. Behind him, a middle-aged man in cargo shorts and a Seahawks cap leaned over to the person next to him and remarked, "Guess first class isn't for everyone." The person chuckled. Terrence caught it, of course he did, but he let it go. He'd spent years mastering that, filtering out noise, swallowing pride without losing himself. That was what his mother taught him. Never let petty individuals displace you. Then another attendant emerged from the jet bridge. This one older, gray hair, tall, appearing to have been with the airline for decades. She didn't introduce herself, didn't offer a greeting, just walked up and said, "What seems to be the concern here?" The redhead interjected, "We're having trouble confirming his seat assignment. It's not matching in the system." The older woman took the boarding pass from Terrence, scrutinized it for less than 3 seconds, then turned to the screen. She typed something, frowned, hit a few more keys. "It says 2A, she muttered. "Paid upgrade booked with rewards and cash. System shows confirmed." Terrence raised an eyebrow slightly. "So?" The woman turned to him. "You can proceed. Apologies for the delay." But even then, there was no apology for what caused the delay, no acknowledgement of the way he'd been pulled aside, held up, stared at, quietly insulted. Just those 4 words, "You can proceed." Terrence gave a nod, not of gratitude but acknowledgement. As he moved forward, the man in the Seahawks hat leaned back in his seat and added, "Guess it worked out for you after all, huh?" Terrence didn't reply. He wasn't there to contend with narrow-minded individuals. He was there to observe, to document, and to recall. As he walked down the jet bridge, the flight attendant from earlier hurried alongside him. "We just want to ensure everyone's in the correct seat," she said, trying to sound casual. "You understand." Terrence looked at her, his voice calm but sharp. "Do you say that to every first-class passenger or just the ones that make you double-check?" She blinked, caught off guard by the directness. Well, it's just protocol." He stepped ahead of her, entering the plane. "Then you might want to revise your protocol." The flight attendant didn't follow him further. A male flight crew member welcomed him aboard, barely glancing at his boarding pass. "Right this way 2A, he stated. Terrence took his seat, window view, clean, spacious. He placed his briefcase under the seat and settled back, eyes steady, mind racing. Across the aisle, a young white man in a Patagonia jacket scrolled through his phone, glanced at Terrence, then looked away. Not a word. That's how it typically went. A moment of tension, then silence. Everyone pretending nothing occurred. The plane moved on, life moved on. But Terrence wasn't just a passenger today. He was an observer, an auditor, and his job wasn't to move on. It was to pay attention. The flight crew began their rounds. A drink cart squeaked into motion. Champagne was offered to all first-class guests. A small gesture, perhaps standard, but it no longer felt standard. Terrence accepted a glass, not out of interest but to maintain character. He sipped, checked the seat pocket for the safety card, unfolded it open and slipped a business card between the pages. A subtle clue just in case. Outside the window, the baggage crew zipped around in orange vests. He watched them while the final passengers boarded. A family with 2 children shuffled past, loud and tired. A college student in a hoodie with headphones bumped into the seat in front of him and didn't apologize. The flight attendant smiled at them all, cheerful as ever. No second glances, no checks, no just making sure tones. Only Terrence had received that treatment today. But none of them had any idea who Terrence truly was. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane doors closed. The captain's voice came over the speakers with the usual pre-flight announcements. Flight time just under 4 hours. Smooth weather expected over the Rockies. Thank you for flying with us. Terrence barely heard a word of it. He sat still, hands resting on his thighs, feeling the memory of that brief confrontation stretch behind his eyes like a taut wire. He'd endured similar situations before. At restaurants, in lobbies, even in courthouse elevators. But this one felt different. This one wasn't just personal, it was evidence. He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a plain matte black smartphone. Not his regular phone. This one was agency-issued. No social apps, no contacts, just notes, secure messaging, and a camera with audio timestamping. He typed slowly, methodically. Subject: Flight 265 DLT. Time 3:42 p.m. Incident: boarding obstruction without cause. Details: flight crew questioned seat validity without checking system. Supervisor confirmed booking in less than 30 seconds. No apology issued. Delayed duration: 6 minutes. Tone: patronizing. Secondary reactions from passengers: mocking, dismissive. He locked the phone and slid it back in his pocket. Across the aisle, the same young man from earlier, Patagonia jacket, AirPods in, leaned his seat back and closed his eyes. A woman 2 rows behind unwrapped a protein bar with exaggerated crinkles. The world kept spinning. A male flight attendant came by, offering warm towels. "Here you go, sir," he said to Terence with a cheerful nod that came a few beats too late to feel natural. Terence accepted the towel and placed it untouched on the tray table. That performative kindness. It was always there once you were no longer a problem. They smoothed it over with small gestures, thinking it erased the disrespect that came before, as if a moist towelette could wash off the memory of being treated like a trespasser in a space you paid for. 15 minutes passed. The engines ignited. The plane began its slow progression to the runway. Terence glanced around the cabin. An older white man behind him was already asleep, mouth open. A businesswoman typed something quickly on her laptop, frowning at a spreadsheet. The world didn't pause, not for indignity, not for discomfort, not even for the truth. Then something caught his eye. Row 4, right side. A mother in her late 50s, brown skin, short curly hair, was making her way to the back with a toddler. Her boarding pass was in her hand. Her economy seat was farther down. She'd asked a flight attendant if she could just stand in first class with the child for a moment while he calmed down. The attendant, same redhead from the gate, shook her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is the first class section. You'll need to move back now." "But I'm not asking to sit, just standing, just for a minute." "Ma'am," the attendant said louder this time, "you're blocking the aisle. You need to return to your seat." Terence watched her shoulders slump. She offered a quiet sorry, and walked down the aisle with the boy, now squirming in her arms. 2 rows later, a white teenage boy came up from coach and leaned across a first-class seat to speak to someone. No one stopped him. No one asked him to move. Terence tapped his notes. Observed passenger in 19C requested assistance multiple times. No response. Neighbor received double service. He knew what this looked like, what it meant. Bias rarely arrived shouting. It came as silence. It came in who was allowed to bend the rules and who was forced to obey every letter of them. The plane taxied to the runway. The cabin rattled gently, then lifted into the sky. Terence turned to the window and watched the buildings shrink away beneath them. Then he closed his eyes. For the first time since boarding, he didn't sleep. He thought about his job, about how often people asked if what he did even mattered, about the times people told him, "Things aren't like that anymore." But it was only the first hour of the flight, and already he had more than enough to report. The clock was ticking and the audit had already begun. About an hour into the flight, the seatbelt sign extinguished and passengers began to settle in. Terence kept his tray up, hands folded, mind sharp. His role today was to observe, not just what was articulated but everything that wasn't. Body language, sideways glances, hesitations, all of it. The same red-headed flight attendant reappeared, now all smiles and soft tone. "Can I get you something to drink, mister?" She glanced at the manifest in her hand, pretending to check even though she already knew. "Dillard," he answered evenly. "Just water, please." "Oh, and thank you for your patience earlier. We had a little tech hiccup at the gate. These things happen, you know." She gave a polite laugh, the kind that invited him to let it all go. Terence smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Do they?" The smile on her face faltered for a second, like a crack in plaster. He leaned back in his seat and added, "Interesting that the hiccup only seemed to apply to me. None of the other passengers in the first-class line were asked to wait." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, she turned and went to fetch the water. That was when the passenger across the aisle leaned in, slightly gray blazer, silver hair, perhaps early 60s. He looked like the kind of man who played tennis on weekends and golfed during the week. "Didn't mean to overhear," the man said, voice low, "but I saw what happened back at the gate. A bit ridiculous if you ask me." Terence turned to him. "Appreciate you saying that. Yeah, they didn't question anyone else. Felt like they were checking something that had nothing to do with a boarding pass." Terence nodded once. "You're not wrong." The man paused. "You fly often?" "I do," Terence replied. The water arrived. The flight attendant placed it gently on his tray as if it were fragile glass. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, eyes flickering. Terence waited until she walked off, then he reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out his ID. It wasn't the usual kind. No fancy badge, no shiny emblem. Just a clear federal credential with his name, title, and agency. Terence Dillard, Senior Investigator, U.S. Department of Transportation, Office of Civil Rights and Aviation Compliance. He held it out briefly toward the silver-haired man who blinked as he read it. I'm not just a passenger, Terrence stated. I'm auditing this flight. The man's face went blank for a beat, then he let out a short breath. Well damn. Terrence chuckled lightly. Yeah. You do this often. Often enough. We run random, unscheduled assessments. See how people are treated, who gets flagged, who gets overlooked, what the patterns are. The man sat back. And what do you do when you see it happening right in front of you? Document it, Terrence replied. And sometimes if it's blatant enough, we escalate. A few rows ahead, the flight attendant handed a beer to a passenger who made a joke loud enough to reach halfway down the cabin. Something about flying being the last place where people know their place. The joke resonated strongly with the guy next to him. Terrence didn't laugh. He took another sip of water and typed 2 more lines in his phone. He knew better than to confront crew mid-flight. That wasn't the objective. He wasn't here to humiliate anyone. He was here to observe how people behave when they believe no one is watching closely. And today they'd shown him plenty. An hour later, the flight crew distributed meals. Terrence was suddenly offered a complimentary upgrade. We'd like to thank you for your loyalty, the redhead said, flashing a new version of her smile. He accepted the meal but said nothing, letting the silence do its work. But Terrence wasn't finished collecting data, not by a long shot. The aroma of reheated chicken and buttered rolls permeated the cabin, mingling with stale air and desultory conversation. Passengers around Terrence had mostly settled into their routines. Movies playing on tiny seatback screens, phones glowing in tray tables, heads leaned back in silence. Terrence picked at his meal without much appetite. He didn't need food right now, he needed patterns, and he was seeing them clear as day. The redhead made another round, asking each first-class passenger if they needed anything else. Her smile stiffened when she reached Terrence again. All good here, she asked. Terrence met her gaze. So far. She moved on quickly. He glanced toward the divider curtain separating first class from economy. It shifted with every step the crew took, opening briefly to reveal glimpses of life on the other side. That's where he noticed her, row 19 aisle seat. An elderly Latina woman with weathered hands and a neck pillow tucked behind her. Her cardigan looked handmade, faded lavender, and she clutched a small paper bag as if it contained something fragile. Every time the flight attendant passed, the woman raised her hand slightly, not boldly, just enough to be noticed. And every time she was overlooked. The attendants walked past her as if she weren't there. Meanwhile, a white teenager in 21B, earbuds in, socks on the seat in front of him, received an extra ginger ale without asking, no hesitation, no delay. Terrence tapped his notes. Observed passenger in 19C requested assistance multiple times. No response. Neighbor received double service. He knew what this looked like, what it signified. Bias rarely arrived shouting. It came as silence. It came in who was seen and who wasn't. Then something else from 2 rows behind the woman. A voice, low, frustrated. Yo, excuse me, hello? Terrence sat up straighter. A young black man in his 20s stood halfway into the aisle, denim jacket, short haircut, polite tone but clear frustration in his voice. He was holding a carry-on bag that wouldn't fit in the overhead bin. I just need to check if there's space in the front. This one's jammed, he said to the passing crew member. The flight attendant paused, didn't look at him right away. She sighed. You need to sit down, sir. We'll handle that when we have time. I've been trying since we boarded. Well, that's not my problem, is it? She replied, still not meeting his eyes. Terrence's eyebrows lifted. There it was again, the tone. No raised voice, no curse words, but the instant shift in demeanor, as if she'd flipped a switch the moment she saw who was speaking. The young man opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. He looked around, suddenly aware that people were watching. Some with curiosity, others with discomfort. That pause was a choice. Not wanting to be labeled, not wanting to be that guy mid-flight. He slowly sat down, the bag crammed awkwardly between his feet. The attendant walked away without a word. Terrence tapped his phone twice, hit record. He captured the interaction, didn't speak, didn't move, just documented. He knew this report was going to be longer than anticipated. He looked around again. 2 white passengers had wandered into the first-class curtain earlier. One to inquire about flight duration, the other to request a pillow. Neither had been told to return to their seats. No tension, no sighs, no problem. Terence closed the note-taking app and leaned back, letting the weight of what he'd witnessed settle. None of this surprised him. That's what made it worse. His job wasn't about catching people in the act. It was about proving in black and white what so many still denied. That some passengers are handled, others are helped, and most days, it depended entirely on who was doing the asking. But back in economy, something occurred that made him press record. The tension in the cabin was quiet but palpable. You wouldn't notice it unless you were seeking it, unless you'd lived through it before. Terence had countless times. He kept his phone recording as he shifted in his seat, eyes still on the young man in row 21. He looked barely 25, clean-cut, the kind of exhaustion that came from striving too hard not to cause trouble. He kept adjusting his legs, trying to find a way to sit comfortably with the oversized carry-on crammed under the seat in front of him. It wasn't working. About 20 minutes later, the same flight attendant returned to his row with the drink cart. She glanced down and paused. "You can't have that there, sir," she said, tapping the bag with her pen. "It has to go in the overhead or be checked." He looked up. "I told you it doesn't fit. I tried, no one helped me." Her voice sharpened. "That's not my fault. You're blocking the aisle space. We can't continue service with this here." "I asked twice when we boarded," he said, trying to remain calm. "You're being difficult," she snapped. "I'll need to notify the captain if you can't follow basic instructions." That did it. A woman across the aisle set her magazine down and looked over. The older lady in 19C clutched her bag a little tighter. Passengers started glancing up again. Whispers crept in. Terence's phone stayed steady in his hand, screen dimmed. He zoomed in just enough to capture the exchange clearly. The young man stood up, hands raised slightly, not aggressively, just open as if to show he wasn't a threat. "Look," he said, "I didn't pack the bins. I just asked for help. That's it." The attendant took a step back. "Sir, I'm going to need you to take your seat immediately or you may be removed when we land." He froze for a second, looked around. No one spoke, not one person. Terence's jaw tightened slightly. He'd witnessed this exact moment before. The quiet crowd, the worried glances, the everyone just wants to get home silence. People who claimed to be allies in conversation turned to window watchers when it mattered. The young man slowly sat back down, his voice low now. "Man, I didn't even raise my voice." The attendant marched away without another word. Terence stopped the recording and saved the file. Then he stood. He walked calmly to the back of the cabin and requested a moment with the lead attendant. A tall man with kind eyes met him near the galley. "Everything all right, sir?" he inquired. Terence showed his credentials without saying a word. The man took a second, scanned it and blinked. Are you?" He lowered his voice. "This flight is under review." Terence nodded. "Unannounced audit, documenting service patterns and discriminatory conduct." The man looked away, suddenly very aware of who had been working which sections. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll let the crew know you're on board." "No need," Terence replied. "They'll find out soon enough." Back at his seat, the young man was now sitting completely still, shoulders hunched, staring ahead. Terence sat back down, opened a new note and wrote, "Incident escalation. Observed passenger labeled, difficult, after multiple ignored requests. Threatened with removal for non-compliance with an impossible request." He paused, added, "No intervention from crew. No support from surrounding passengers." Silence. He watched the sky out the window for a moment, the clouds layered like torn pages. Then he turned back to his screen, flipped through past entries and shook his head once. It was almost always the same story. Different faces, different cities, same script. But once the plane landed, Terence made one call. The wheels touched down on the tarmac at Seattle-Tacoma International with a soft thud, and the cabin offered the usual quiet applause from the passengers who still felt the need to acknowledge gravity. Terence didn't clap. He simply shut off airplane mode and tapped open the secure app on his agency device. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began stirring, unbuckling early, retrieving jackets from overhead bins, pretending not to make eye contact with anyone they might have silently judged or ignored. Terence typed the final details into his audit log. Then he made the call. "Office of Aviation Compliance, this is Colleen." "It's Dillard. Flight 265 completed." Colleen didn't need more than that. Report coming today? Yes, and video attachments as well. She paused. That quick. It's not a long flight. When they hand you a case in the first 30 minutes, back in his seat, the redhead passed by one last time. Her smile was gone now, replaced with something more cautious. She nodded slightly but said nothing. Terrence stood and reached for his briefcase. The young man from row 21 also stood, rubbing his knee, trying to maneuver his oversized bag out from under the seat. He looked weary, not physically, but the kind of exhaustion that settles on your shoulders after you've spent hours enduring disrespect just to avoid a scene. Terrence met his eyes briefly, gave a look that said, "I saw it. All of it." The young man gave a tiny nod back. Just that. Nothing else. They exited the plane separately. At the terminal, Terrence stepped aside and pulled out his regular phone. He took a moment, then opened the notepad where he kept a different kind of record. One for himself. Seattle bias confirmed. Crew escalation patterns match prior incidents. Passenger treated as threat despite compliance. Witness silence consistent. He saved the file, exhaled slowly and headed toward the escalators. By the end of the week his full report was filed. Names were anonymized, video footage reviewed, timestamps analyzed. What the airline didn't know not yet was that this flight had become a case study. Not because of a massive blow-up, not because of a headline-grabbing incident, but because it revealed something far more common, far more insidious. The pattern of everyday discrimination disguised as procedure. 3 weeks later the airline received a formal notice. A request for internal policy review. The crew from Flight 265 was called into meetings, some quiet, some not. HR terms were circulated. One attendant resigned, 2 others were flagged for retraining. But none of that made the news. No public scandal, no press release. Just another day behind the curtain of compliance. What did change was subtle. The airline added a new line to its first-class training module. Staff should be mindful of unconscious bias in seat verification procedures. It sounded bureaucratic, safe, tucked away between bullet points about boarding efficiency and customer service tone. But Terrence saw it. He knew what it meant. It meant they'd been watched and that someone, just one person, had felt the weight of accountability, even if only for a moment. He was back in D.C. when he received a short message from Colleen. Incident 265 flagged for recurring pattern. Seattle route under ongoing review. That was enough. Not everything, but enough for now. Because Terrence didn't do this work for attention. He didn't do it to go viral or incite conflict. He did it so fewer people would have to endure the same silence he did. So the young man in row 21 wouldn't have to choose between being quiet and being labeled. So the woman in 19C wouldn't have to raise her hand again and be bypassed. He closed the file, shut down his computer and looked out the window of his small home office. Not at anything in particular, just the street, the world, the kind of ordinary moment where these narratives begin again and again. But for Terrence this was never about punishment. On Saturday morning, Terrence sat at his kitchen table in Silver Spring, Maryland. No reports, no badge on the table. Just him, a mug of black coffee and the quiet hum of his refrigerator. He scrolled through the week's headlines. War, politics, another celebrity scandal. Nothing about Flight 265. No outrage, no statement from the airline. Nothing. And that, he thought, is precisely why the work matters. He glanced over at the corner bookshelf where a photo of his late mother sat, framed in gold trim. Her smile always reminded him of Sundays, gospel music and wisdom disguised as casual advice. "Stay calm, baby," she used to say, "but never stay silent. Silence doesn't keep you safe, it just keeps you stuck." She knew something about being stuck. She'd worked for 38 years as a nurse in Cleveland. Always the one covering holiday shifts, always the one asked to explain herself twice. She never complained, but Terrence remembered how her voice changed when she got home, softer, as if it had been carrying more weight than she let on. That's where he'd learned it. Not just how to conduct himself, but when to speak and when to listen. He picked up his notebook and added a few thoughts, not for the audit, just for himself. It's not the yelling that does the damage. It's the disbelief. The moments when you're told you're imagining it, that your experience is inconvenient, that maybe, just maybe, you overreacted. That was the real erosion. The wear and tear of always having to prove what you already know is true. His phone buzzed. A text from a friend who worked in transportation law. "Heard about your last audit. Subtle but sharp. Nicely done. Terrence smiled. That was the objective. Not drama, not headlines, just proof, documented, undeniable proof. He thought again of the young man in row 21, still probably thinking about that flight, still wondering if he did something wrong. Terrence wished he could tell him, "No, you didn't. You were just too visible in a space that prefers you quiet. You were asking for help in a system that assumes you're asking for trouble." He thought of all the people who had remained silent on that flight. The ones who saw, heard, and chose to look away. And he didn't blame them, not completely. People get tired. People get scared. But silence is still a choice. Maybe that's the real lesson, that everyday bias doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's a shrug, a delay, a raised eyebrow at a boarding pass, a skipped hand in row 19. It's not always dramatic. That's what makes it dangerous. Terrence didn't expect the world to change overnight, but it would never change at all if people kept pretending there wasn't a problem. And change, real change, starts small. With a look, a question, a moment of courage in a quiet place. He finished his coffee, stood up and walked to the window. Outside, a child was helping his grandfather unload groceries. Nothing significant, just life unfolding at its own pace. And that's what Terrence fought for. Not attention, not status, just the right for people like him to move through life without being scrutinized twice before stepping away. He opened his notes app one last time. To anyone who's ever been stared at for occupying space they paid for, you're not imagining it and you're not alone. Stay calm but never stay silent. If this story made you pause, made you think, or reminded you of something you've experienced, subscribe for more real stories. Stories that don't always make the news but still need to be told.